Okay, welcome, year 12. It's our last lesson on religion and ethics, and it's on the topic euthanasia. So you will have explored this already in your GCSE. This is one of the applied ethics units, which means you need to be able to write about it, but also to apply natural law and situation ethics. Okay, so euthanasia. First thing to talk about are some excellent resources which you can access. So this is the Pampsycast podcast. Has all sorts of different videos about the course. It's a podcast, so it's audio. So follow the link at the bottom. PepEd, this is a resource which is written by your examiners. So you can use this. There's the link at the bottom. And this is possibly the best documentary I've ever seen on euthanasia by Terry Pratchett. It's called The Right to Die. I strongly suggest you watch this. And then another very good documentary, Louis Theroux, Choosing Death. Okay, so definitions. So euthanasia means good death. It comes from the Greek, meaning good death. What it means is helping someone to die through mercy, through love, because they are in pain. Voluntary is when the person chooses it themselves. Non-voluntary is when it's chosen for them because they're not in a position to make that choice. That might be because they're in a coma or they're too sick. Passive and active is about how it's done. So passive is the removal of care. So maybe switching off a life support machine or no longer giving medication so that the person dies of their natural causes. And this is actually technically legal in Britain. It's called the removal of burdensome care. And then we have active, and active is illegal. This is where we're actually giving someone something which artificially ends their life. So this is illegal in the United Kingdom. It is legal in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, but this is considered killing in Britain, so it's not legal. Now, it can be combinations because these two are to do with who's making the choice. These two are to do with how it's done. So you can have voluntary passive, voluntary active, non-voluntary passive, and non-voluntary active. And the reason that euthanasia is a problem is because, well, we have no problem putting animals out of their misery, putting them down, but humans somehow are considered more valuable, more sacred. Murder is considered wrong, and excuse me, euthanasia seems to be very similar to murder. It involves taking a human life, and it's against the law to do this. Maybe we're acting as though we're gods. We're doing something that's not allowed. There's also a difficulty about consent, about choice, especially if the individual is unable to make the decision themselves, so non-voluntary euthanasia. Okay, so there are lots of issues. So we have secular arguments now. Now, a secular argument means a non-religious argument. So secular arguments for euthanasia, the idea of autonomy. Your life belongs to you, so you should be able to decide when it ends, no one else. It relieves pain. The quality of life is so low that it might justify the ending of life. Prevents family going through pain. Hippocrates, father of modern medicine, came up with the Hippocratic Oath, does allow some forms of euthanasia if the patient is incurable. And it shouldn't be about the law, it should be between a doctor and their patient. There are secular arguments against euthanasia. You could argue that it's murder, and it could lead to a situation where doctors are being encouraged to kill their patients, It's a famous example of a doctor called Harold Shipman, who was encouraged, not encouraged, but he murdered his patients. And we don't want to encourage this kind of behaviour. It's illegal in the UK. It takes life. It goes against what doctors swear to do, which is to preserve life with the Hippocratic Oath. And you could argue that there are alternatives, such as hospices. So Christians tend to be very against euthanasia. That's because Christians value the Ten Commandments, do not kill, but they also value the idea that we have the sanctity of life. We're made in the image of God. There's a part of us which is dignified and like God. So Jesus healed people, he didn't kill people. That's one argument. So these are arguments, for euthanasia. Let's go for arguments against. Ten Commandments, do not kill. God decides when you die. He gives you new life. Your days were written before you were born. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because in my opinion, this quote, your days were written, suggests that maybe helping people isn't right, because let's say someone's dying and you give them medicine, surely you're changing God's plan. So there's a question about what actually is God's plan. Are you helping God fulfill his plan by being a doctor and giving medicine, or being a doctor and allowing someone to die? Or are you going against it? Quite complex. Okay, Christian views for euthanasia. You could argue that blessed are the merciful, from the Beatitudes, love your neighbor. Jesus wanted to help people and end suffering. But then we can't really imagine Jesus wanting to kill people, can we? Okay, so this is the example that you looked at for your GCSE. This is Sally, 90 years old. She's had a stroke. She's in a lot of pain and she wants help to die. Should she be allowed? Now, the first question we could ask is, why doesn't Sally kill herself? Well, suicide is actually legal in the United Kingdom. It might not be good, but it's not illegal. The answer to this is that she might not be able to. It's also very messy. She can't have loved ones around her. It's not dignified. It might not work. There's loads of reasons why suicide isn't good. So should she be allowed help? She asks her nurse. Now, you could argue yes, you could argue no, and that's what we're going to explore in this lesson. So she has different types of euthanasia that she could ask for. So first of all, let's look at voluntary. So I want to die. She has asked for it herself. Now, let's say she slips into a coma and the nurse makes a decision for her. Well, that's non-voluntary. Lots of people say that non-voluntary is worse because it involves less autonomy, less free choice. Okay, if you stop her treatment, that's passive. Many people say that's better because you're allowing nature to take its course. Give her a lethal injection, well, that's active. Many people say that's worse because you're actually killing in that case. Some people think of passive as not really killing because you're just letting nature take its course. Okay, and we have some other case studies that you can read through now. So our patient has had a heart attack, her heart has not restarted, not going to resuscitate her. This is non-voluntary. Okay, so feel free to read through these. This one is voluntary. This one is non-voluntary. This one is voluntary. This one is same case studies because we can have combinations. This one is passive. This one is active. This one is passive. This one is passive. Okay, so euthanasia remains illegal in the UK. And that's because we're a largely Christian country traditionally. Christianity believes that killing is wrong. Do not kill, the sanctity of life. There's also another argument which is made, which suggests that there is a slippery slope. The slippery slope is the idea that if we legalize something, and in the future, we may end up sliding into a situation which is worse. So, for example, in 1967, abortion was legalized. Slippery slope, well, by 2018, abortion is available for any reason. Now, it was first made legal just for specific cases, but after a while, abortion is available for any reason at all. So this is the argument. If we legalize euthanasia for very rare cases, then what's going to happen in the future? We might be in a situation where people are being killed for just any old reason, just because they're old. This is called a slippery slope argument. Some philosophers have said that this is actually a bad argument. So sometimes it's called a slippery slope fallacy. So a fallacy means a logical mistake. So lots of people say that just because something is legalized, it doesn't mean that we're going to end up in a worse situation. For example, lots of people said if we legalize abortion, that means that no one's ever going to have a pregnancy in the future, or no one's ever going to have children in the future. But that didn't happen. So it's a bit like saying, well, you know what? If we allow this to happen, then what could happen in the future? And that's actually a bad argument. So you could write in an essay that some philosophers believe that it's a slippery slope. Other philosophers believe that it won't be a slippery slope. A slippery slope is a bad argument. It's a fallacy. Okay, so I strongly suggest you watch this video when you have time. Okay, so sanctity of life. Now, you don't have to be religious to believe in the sanctity of life. It just means that you think that life is valuable and sacred. However, traditionally, it is a religious concept. And it comes from Genesis, the idea that we're made in the image of God. So a part of God's nature is reflected in us. So human life should be preserved. It's dignified. It's gracious. It's special. It's the highest value. So human life is sacred for these reasons, according to Christianity. So the Christian attitude, constantly throughout the Bible, Jesus dies so that we can have life. Salvation is life. Sanctity of life is so important. But why is life sacred? Well, because we have reason, image of God, free will, consciousness. The question becomes, is life sacred if you're in a coma then? If you're in a coma, you don't have consciousness or free will or reason. Or maybe you have the potential for them, but you don't have them at the moment. And what about if you're severely mentally disabled? Does that mean your life isn't sacred? So this is the issue of personhood. What does it mean to be a person? We're going to come on to that later. So life is precious. Does that mean it's always wrong to take a life, though? Well, no, because what about in other situations, like Christians are for the death penalty sometimes, self-defense, sacrificial death, abortion. What about in war? So you could say just because of the sanctity of life, that doesn't mean that euthanasia shouldn't be allowed. Because arguably euthanasia is just another form of killing, and killing is allowed in Christianity. So there is an argument here. So someone might say, I oppose euthanasia because I believe in the sanctity of life. They may say this because God gave life, it's a gift. Thou shalt not kill. We're created in the image of God. Only God can take life away. Okay, now some Christians, very rare, but some Christians might say that we don't have the sanctity of life. It's this Protestant idea that since the fall from grace, our life isn't as sacred anymore, or that God is constantly killing people in the Bible, which suggests life isn't sacred. This is very rare. Okay, so does the sanctity of life actually have any relevance in modern society? Well, you could say yes, because you don't have to be religious. You could say yes, because we're traditionally a Christian culture. Yes, because we all value life. Yes, because natural law values life. You could say no, it's outdated. There's lots of potential responses here. Feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, we have other responses here as well. Okay, so quality of life. This means what your life is actually like. So a high quality of life might be you're healthy, you're well off, you're happy. A low quality of life might be you're unhealthy, you're in poverty, and you're unhappy. Now, some people think if the quality is low, this means the sanctity doesn't matter anymore, because quality is what matters. The difficulty of this argument is who defines a low quality of life? For example, Stephen Hawkins, severely disabled, paralyzed. Many people might say that they would want to die in that situation. That's a low quality of life. But Stephen Hawkins had a brilliant life. He loved his life and he didn't want to die. Similarly, you could argue that being depressed is a low quality of life. Or you could argue that anything is a low quality of life. Surely it's subjective. So who defines quality? There's a tricky question there. Okay, so we could argue, is she living with dignity? Well, again, what is dignity? Someone might say that being poor or being depressed means that they should be allowed to die. Does her life have value? Well, who decides that? Stephen Hawkins believed that his life had immense value, but other people in that situation may wish to take the euthanasia option. So this is a theme which is explored throughout history. So in ancient Greece, euthanasia was often a solution to problems, and this is mentioned in Greek culture. So from plays from ancient Athens, so Prometheus Bound, the character said, maybe it's better to die than to drag out your lingering days. Heracles in the Women of Trachis asks his son to help him to die. So this is something that could be mentioned in an essay. These are pre-Christian cultures, though. So in pre-Christian cultures, euthanasia was seen as much more acceptable. So dying with dignity, then. This is the idea that in your death, you should be allowed to go in a way that is nice, a way that is full of kind of respect. You know, you're not old and sick and diseased and in pain and you feel embarrassed. You might want to go in a good, quick way. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, came up with the Hippocratic Oath, which all doctors have to take today. And part of it actually seems to allow passive euthanasia. Refuse to treat patients who are overmastered by their disease. So you could argue that sort of passive euthanasia might be acceptable according to the Hippocratic Oath. Okay, so let's look at Christianity, the church in particular. Christians tend to be very much against euthanasia. The big exception is situation ethics, because situation ethics isn't against anything. Anything is acceptable as long as in that situation is a loving outcome. Should religious beliefs influence ethical decisions? Are we still a Christian country? Should it be doctors rather than religion? Okay, so very tricky questions, and we'll be looking at some answers to that later on. Okay, so the next thing we need to look at is personhood. Personhood is the idea that you're not just a body, you're not just a human, you're not just a bag of skin and blood, but you're a person. To be a person means you have free will, conscience, ability to use reason, human rights, intelligence, emotion. And the argument is that, a dead body isn't a person anymore. Personhood becomes very difficult to define, though. When does it begin? What's the difference between an animal and a human? Does an animal have personhood? And importantly, when does personhood end? So this is a person who is brain dead. Their brain has been starved of oxygen, which means it's died. But the heart is beating and the body is kept alive because of a life support machine. Is this a person still? And if it's not, or if he's not, should he or it be euthanized, be killed? Is it murder if they're not a person anymore? Is the person on the left more of a person than the person or the body on the right? It becomes very, very tricky. If you say yes, then you have an issue because that means if you're in a coma, technically you're not a person. Maybe if you're mentally disabled, you're not a person. Maybe if you're asleep, you're not a person, right? So it becomes very tricky. Okay, so feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, so personhood, very tricky problem. I think according to many Christians, all human beings, no matter what they are, their conditions are persons, because we're made in the image of God. Now, arguably, you could say this person isn't in the image of God anymore because they can't do any of these features. Should they be allowed to die? They could be kept on this life support machine indefinitely, forever. Should they be allowed to die? Okay, so we're on to the next idea, which is autonomy. Autonomy means you have control over your life. So who will decide if you go to university or not? It will be you. Who will decide what job you have when you're older? It will be you. Who'll decide where you live when you're older? It will be you. You have autonomy, you have freedom. Who will decide how you die? It won't be you. You're not allowed to decide how you die. The law takes that decision out of your hands. And lots of people say that there is something really wrong with this. You should have autonomy or control over your own life and death. And this is something that J.S. Mill talks about in his book on liberty. He says that unless you are hurting another person, the government has no right whatsoever to control you. You can do whatever you want with your own body. It belongs to you. So I think Mill would be for allowing euthanasia. So what is autonomy? Feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, Gregory E. Pence, a critic, says it's not wrong to help the dying die because they are actually dying. This is an interesting critic. You're not really killing because they're in the process of dying anyway. So should we have the right to decide when we die? Whose job should it be? Ours? Maybe the doctor's? The problem with the doctor is that we don't want doctors to be killing people. We want doctors to be saving people. Would you feel comfortable going to hospital if you knew that a doctor had the right to kill you? Also, it could lead to situations where you're pressuring elderly relatives the elderly relative knows that they're a bit of a burden on their family, they may feel like, oh, I don't really want to die, but I better. So this is another example of a slippery slope argument. We might not be respecting the sick and the elderly if we allow euthanasia. So the terminally ill should always have the right to die. This is a tricky question. And here are some responses. Feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, so Hippocrates states, I will not prescribe a deadly drug to please someone, nor give advice that may cause his death. So because of this, doctors have sworn with the Hippocratic Oath that they are not to allow euthanasia. So euthanasia, or allowing someone to die, isn't allowed. Voluntary euthanasia then. So let's imagine you're so sick and you want somebody to help you to die. Should this be allowed? Well, it's very tricky. The wife or the person who does it could be arrested. And this is for good reason, because we don't want to be in a situation where people are killing other people. Also, this guy might change his mind. So there are issues. Now, let's say this person is in pain. Okay, fine, maybe that's allowed. But let's say he's just bored. He just doesn't like life anymore. He's depressed. Should that be allowed? Well, on the one hand, who are we to judge why he wants to die? He has autonomy. But on the other hand, we don't want to kill someone because they're depressed. Maybe he could change his mind if we just gave him some help. So it's very tricky. And Jonathan Glover says the following things. So Jonathan Glover, a very important philosopher, he said we should consider whether the person's decision is serious or not, whether it's reasonable, whether they're likely to change their mind. A doctor is not likely to help somebody because the doctor has sworn the Hippocratic Oath. So who is going to do it then? Family members? Well, they could be arrested. Well, maybe we make a profession of killers, people who are allowed to kill people, but that's a bit grim, isn't it? I mean, would you want to do that job? So I strongly suggest you watch this video with the example of Jack Keverikian. So which is less morally questionable then? A doctor killing you, or your wife or husband killing you? Very, very tricky question. Who is going to actually do the euthanasia? Let's imagine your husband or your partner is in so much pain they just want help to die. Well, some people might reject this because they could say that he could change his mind. And also, if we allow it, in the future, you could kill your partner and just say that they didn't want to live anymore. So it opens the door to all sorts of situations where murder becomes more acceptable. That's the argument. So there are three main reasons that voluntary euthanasia would be rejected. Could lead to involuntary. Involuntary is different to non-voluntary. Involuntary means you are forcing someone who doesn't want to die to die. It's the same as murder. And the Nazis did this. They thought that they were mercy killing people that they considered subhuman. So patients might be discouraged from going to hospital for treatment. It could affect palliative or end-of-life care because you wouldn't be focusing on helping people get better. You'd be focusing on killing them instead. So many people are against euthanasia because hospices are a better option. A hospice is a system where you go into care and they look after you. They look after you. But you die of your illness. That's the important point. They don't kill you. Instead, they look after you. Okay, so hospices might be a better option then for people who are terminally ill. because it allows them to die naturally and with dignity. So, what is our hospice and what are its aims? But this would change, obviously, if voluntary euthanasia was legal. Instead of feeling as though they were able to die of their illness with dignity, they may be asked, well, can we help you to die? And there may be pressure put on people to do this. So are these arguments actually valid? Well, Glover thinks no. So the first argument is it could lead to involuntary euthanasia. His response is, well, that's not valid because it's a slippery slope fallacy. Voluntary is unlikely to lead to involuntary. Secondly, patients might be discouraged from going to hospital for treatments. Well, he says that this is a bad argument because you can't be sure that this is going to happen. Thirdly, it would affect palliative or end-of-life care as the focus would be turned towards ending life. He says that it could happen, but really people will be able to opt in or opt out of euthanasia. So Glover doesn't necessarily believe that these are strong arguments. So this is the kind of thing you can write in an essay. You can write reasons why maybe euthanasia is a problem, and then reasons why a critic may disagree with these reasons. Okay, so should voluntary euthanasia be permitted? That's the question we've been looking at, and there's lots and lots of issues and lots of problems surrounding this. Okay, non-voluntary euthanasia is when someone's not able to ask permission because maybe they're in a coma or their illness is so advanced that they're no longer able to give consent. And most people say that this form would be, in many ways, worse. Some would say in many ways better. It could be better because at least the illness is so advanced that euthanasia might be seen as a good thing, as justified, because the person can't even communicate anymore. You can't keep somebody on a machine forever. However, some people would say it's a bad thing because we don't know what the person's intention is. And there's a difference between non-voluntary and involuntary, obviously. So non-voluntary is you're doing it for the patient's best interests. Involuntary is really just murder. So our best example of involuntary euthanasia would be the Nazis who forcefully euthanized people who they believed were weak or who were not deserving of life. Okay, so let's imagine your physical body is being kept alive artificially. You have no ability to move or think or communicate. Is ending a life a good thing? Well, this is a tricky question. We don't know what she would want. Now, lots of people do sign documents such as DNR documents, which means do not resuscitate. That means that they are giving direct instructions on whether to bring them back if they've the heart stopped or they've stopped breathing. However, most people don't sign these things because most people don't expect it to happen. No one expects to be on a life support machine. And a lot of the time it's from accidents, like car accidents. So when somebody hasn't signed this, how do we possibly make that decision for them? Okay, can we justify ending a life based on love? It's a tricky question. Well, the law says that passive euthanasia is acceptable and the doctor can do this. The family members can also make this decision as well. Okay, so 2 reasons why voluntary euthanasia is better. And 2 reasons why non-voluntary maybe is better. Okay, so we've mentioned this already, but burdensome extraordinary treatments. So This is where in the UK technically passive euthanasia is legal because doctors, family members, and individuals are allowed to say that they don't want burdensome, extraordinary treatment, which means invasive, painful sometimes treatment that keeps them alive. So this could be, for example, removing a life support machine, not being resuscitated, withdrawing feeding tubes. This is very different to active euthanasia because active euthanasia is actually killing somebody. So passive and removing burdensome extraordinary treatment are very similar. Okay. So which should be aimed for? Taking all possible steps to preserve life or allowing people to die? Maybe death isn't such a bad thing. Maybe it's something that is natural and normal. People should be allowed to do. Maybe it's part of God's plan to let people die. So there's even a religious element to this as well. Okay, so is this morally sound? Act in a way that has death as a foreseen additional step of treatment. For the natural law tradition, euthanasia will always be wrong. However, it is acceptable as an unintended byproduct. So if you give somebody drugs to relieve or alleviate their pain, and then this accidentally, it could have been foreseen, but it's not the intention, leads to them dying. This is acceptable in natural law because of double effect. It's not your intention, it's not your interior motive. Is it any better taking no steps to preserve life but also not killing? Well, lots of people would say that's the same thing, so it becomes very, very tricky. So, we seem to be afraid of deliberate acts of killing, but less so with passive euthanasia. And it's for these reasons. Okay. Now, Peter Singer, who is a preference utilitarian, who talks about maximizing people's preferences, talks about the example of Mrs. B, who was a 95-year-old who was no longer able to eat or drink. She begged the doctor to help ease her suffering by killing her. The doctor agreed it was the best thing to do, but then the doctor was prosecuted. He was charged. And this case eventually led to the legalization of voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands. So Peter Singer obviously is going to say that this was her preference, so this is the right thing to have done. Okay, so burdensome treatment. Okay, so we have another example, Simon. Motor neuron disease. His wife was against assisted suicide and didn't want to help him to die. He travelled to the Netherlands anyway. This is one of the arguments for legalizing it, is at the moment you've got to travel to different countries if you want to perform euthanasia or if you want to have it performed on you. However, this means that you're going to be separated from your loved ones because often your loved ones won't come, because if they do, they could be charged with assisted killing when they arrive back in the UK. So should a person have complete autonomy over the decisions made in their life? Well, here are some suggestions for you to read through. Should a person have complete autonomy? Again, we have some other suggestions. Please feel free to pause this and read through it. Okay, what is a life support machine? So a life support machine is something that artificially keeps you alive. Okay, and there can be lots of different examples of this as well. A good example of a life support machine and the ethical issues surrounding it is Tony Bland's. Tony Bland was paralyzed in the Hillsborough disaster, and he campaigned for the right to have, well, his family, sorry, campaigned for the right to have his life support machine switched off, and he was actually successful. this led to the law being changed. So feel free to read through this as well. Okay, so what is a life support machine? What's it used for? Information here. Okay, so to keep people alive artificially, why not through life support machines? Well, here's some suggestions. Okay, so we're looking at some AO2 issues now. Give 2 reasons for and 2 reasons against the use of life support machines. And feel free, please, to read through these in your own time. Which form of euthanasia is better, passive or active? Again, feel free to read through this in your own time. Is there a moral difference between intervention to end a patient's life and non-intervention? So is there a difference between active and passive? Okay, and we have some approaches now applying natural law and situation ethics. So natural law is going to be against euthanasia because it goes against worlds. In particular, it goes against the precept defend self and the innocent. So the Catholic Church will be against it. Okay, so this is casuistry, working out our purpose, good and bad secondary precepts. And the idea of sanctity of life is so important to the Catholic Church, and it's wrong to request to die because you're going against the natural will to live. However, it might be different with double effects. So if it's an unintended consequence of giving pain relief, you should follow the virtues, one of which is fortitude or courage in the face of suffering, and avoid the vices. Okay, situation ethics. Now, Fletcher was pro-euthanasia. However, situation ethics isn't for or against anything, because situation ethics states that there's only one good, and that's love. So it's going to depend on the situation. Some situations, euthanasia might not be the most loving thing to do, but in some situations it might be. Okay, so Fletcher believed the quality of life mattered more than the sanctity. He also argued that people with a certain IQ level, rationality, perhaps weren't persons. So if you're in a life support machine, this is very controversial, but this is something he did say. Okay, so we apply the 6 fundamental principles and the 4 working principles. Okay, Fletcher actually talks in his book about the example of the insurance problem and states that in this situation, the most loving thing to do would be to allow the person to die, because then the family gets the money for the insurance. Okay. You could argue, though, that the individual who's performing euthanasia, if it's a family member, it might be storge rather than agape. So there is an issue there. And also following the example of Jesus in the New Testament, showing love, blessed are the merciful, etc. Okay, so here is an essay. I'm going to not read through it, but instead we're going to just leave it paused on the board for a few seconds so you can pause the video and read through it yourself. Okay, euthanasia is always morally wrong. Discuss. Okay, and we've made it to under an hour, which is excellent. So that's the end of our euthanasia lesson, and that's the end of our ethics unit. So thank you very much, Year 12.